So, hello and welcome to the inaugural Oracle podcast with me, Blair Walker, and my esteemed colleague, David Lowe. Hello, David.
Good afternoon.
The podcast is going to be a conversation about mobile, software development, and digital transformation. And in the coming weeks and months, we're going to have a range of guests from financial services organizations and digital health businesses on to talk about their work, their culture, and their innovative solutions that they're bringing to market. For those of you who don't know, Oracle are a software development agency who aim to make lives better with mobile technologies. We also do a range of work from cloud computing to web solutions through to connected devices, voice applications, and augmented reality solutions. And today, David and I are going to start our podcast series by looking at 4 potentially thorny topics which have come up in the press recently. Maybe some of them won't be thorny at all. So we're just going to fire straight in. I'll present the question, David. You give me your opinion and we'll discuss what we think of the topic at hand. Does that sound good?
Good to me. The opinions of us are not necessarily anything to do with those of Oracle. We should probably add, just in case.
Exactly. Yeah.
Go off piste a little bit.
Exactly, as we tend to do in these conversations. So the first one's, I suppose, more specifically related to mobile app development. So there was news last week that Wix are entering the no-code native app market, giving businesses the opportunity to have a branded native mobile application from a function library on a retainer model. It's going to start, I believe, at $200 per month in terms of cost. And I was wondering what you think of Wix entering the market, and I suppose more broadly, what do you think about these no-code and low-code platforms as a solution, and potentially what impact it has on us as an enterprise application developer?
I think the first thing is that, as always, if you've been in this game a while, it's nothing new. There have been companies trying to get into the sort of apps off the shelf market, if you want to call it that, for a long time now, and for a lot less than $200 a month. So even though things have traveled a long way since, I think the first one I saw was 2010 or thereabouts for native apps.
Yeah.
They've actually got more expensive, and that's maybe just a reflection of how difficult they are. The first one I remember seeing was a video tech company that wanted to provide players as brochures for people, like, if you imagine Marks and Spencer's, to show somebody twirling in a dress and things like that. So effectively, like uploading a playlist to YouTube, you would upload a playlist to the video company and they would turn that into something that was effectively embedded HTML inside a wrapper that became a thing you put in the App Store. And instantly people started to find that Apple in particular took offense to these and started to say, right, this is not native enough. And ultimately it was the platform that wasn't native enough and not the app. But a load of people found they were doing some good content, but actually not able to make use of the platform to expose it. So it caused a bit of bad feeling. And this is 10, 11 years ago, that far back. So I know things have changed in what's tolerable by users and the app stores themselves, but I can't imagine that much has. Because ultimately, I'm slightly going off tangent a little bit, but Apple and Google, when they police the app stores, are effectively policing their own guidelines, which are there to promote user experience. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, if you think about Apple's the human interface guidelines they used to use to vet apps, they're ultimately there for good reasons in the end, for what they think is the best practice on the platform, and they evolve over time. And you can't think that a platform like Wix, which isn't the best application of providing a website to somebody, would be the best application for a native app either. So I think at a certain level, there'll be people that want to put an app in the store for a particular reason, will like this as a way to augment their site. There may be a particular reason they want to carry context of a user that a website just can't do through some sensory input that the phone can give them. But if they want to get to enterprise level, do it well, do it consistently, attach it to devices and and keep up with the way phones change over time, for example, then it's not going to quite cut it. But there will always be people who have just a basic need and a basic level of spend that there will always be a market for it, I guess, and there's nothing wrong with that. Interestingly,
let me hit you with a couple of stats that I read when I was listening to a podcast about this story. So it was saying that Wix in their press release said that their decision to enter the market was driven by data. And the two data points they mentioned were that in their experience, e-commerce operations with a native mobile application saw a 160% increase in transactions, and that service businesses with a native mobile application saw a 500% increase in bookings. Now, both of those seem large, and without any source information sound very difficult to contextualize. But obviously they're trying to use that as an angle in to say, this is the reason that you need this product. And especially if you're in e-commerce or in sort of services organizations, then this could be the solution for you. I mean, it feels like the use cases for it are somewhat narrow because of the kind of sort of componentized kind of service offerings that might be available inside these applications. Do you think that's the case?
That's probably true. And I guess if you strip that back, there must be a reason for the higher conversion, if that's what it is in a native app. And there may well be things a native app can expose, such as Apple Pay, Face ID, or something just makes it more frictionless than a website would be. So I guess there must be something in that, in the statistic. I guess from the other side, I would imagine, I'm not saying anything about Wix's business model, but if you've used Wix, they try to steer you towards some of their other features once you're subscribed to them, that starts to lead you into customer service and the more expensive tools behind the scenes, which somebody working in the conversion and sales business would need to have, and like the fulfillment end of it. So yeah. I would imagine there's an upsell behind this that people are actually elegantly paying to be upsold to, if that makes sense. And I think as a business for Wix, that's incredibly good, but I still think it will always be a step back from the ideal experience you might want, whilst that statistic's probably true.
Yeah. Interesting. Oh, well, I think we've suitably covered that off. And if we're going to stick to our timeline for our first ever podcast episode, we're going to have to move on now. Is that okay with you, David?
Perfectly fine.
Wonderful. Right, let's move into a slightly stickier topic that we are going to cover now in health. So 2 weeks ago, the NHS England, and they appointed their first female CEO, Amanda Pritchard, which obviously is great to see, and I'm sure as many people feel we would say is long overdue. Her main objective was health service digital transformation. And my sort of question to you is that how do you go about prioritizing your transformation efforts when you have such a large, complex organization with so many kind of prescient challenges? Like, how do you go about sort of, sort of eating the elephant bit by bit, so to speak?
Or boiling the ocean, or some other consultant phrase that we might pull out of our posterior this way. I think the lesson from the last year is that things are possible if you apply certain ways of working. So some of the things that spun up through COVID wouldn't have been done 2 years ago, but now we've seen they can be. But the lesson from that is that you go for quick wins. Now, in COVID, some of the quick wins were just non-negotiable, that we had to have a certain testing and reporting apparatus, and we had to have certain other things like that.
Yep.
And even away from health, things like the furlough scheme just existed in the space of 6 weeks. So it is doable, but that effectively came from a forced roadmap that there had to be certain things done first. So I can't imagine the NHS can do anything other than think of the sharpest end of the system that's the easiest thing to start with. Mm-hmm. And have the highest impact. And I'm trying to think in my head what that might be, but I suspect things like the GP end seems like a good place to start. That even having GPs work on a triage platform or Zoom or something like that they can all share, and has common ways of people reporting certain things. That's essentially what COVID did. So you had to have certain symptoms to get a test. So yep. Something at that end, I would imagine, would have a lot of commonality between GP, A&E, NHS 24, things like that.
And do you think that
yeah.
similar to like the sort of financial services digital transformation that's occurred with all these fintechs spinning up, do you imagine that the NHS's transformation will be like linked to a partnership ecosystem where lots of like healthcare startups and lots of sort of new solutions are plugging into that environment, and less so than the NHS building them from scratch themselves?
I think it'll have to be to allow the growth to happen quickly. So if you imagine there are people who will sell you services for varying prices, but you've got to know they exist. And the thing that always holds back a marketplace from happening is people exposing the fact they sell things. I mean, there's always demand for it, but two-sided markets. Amazon's a classic example that, you know, they expose lots of people who sell paper clips who you would never find otherwise if it didn't exist. So if the NHS was able to offer something like a health store, to give it a name, that you could turn up and say, right, I need a flu jab, I don't qualify, so where do I go? And there are people you can find locally that will give you it for £15 or whatever it is. That's the sort of thing that only they can offer at scale, really. There are many providers who are trying to do this individually, but you can imagine them leading people to purchases that way. And I can see that opening the door for an awful lot of people to offer services that can see the demand that they wouldn't do otherwise.
Yeah, it's the. Do you think that the fragmented nature of large organizations like a National Health Service, where you might have it sort of I don't know, like structured by region or the like, do you think that that is a good thing, in that once you've delivered something in one region, it's then repeatable in all the subsequent regions, and that you'll see sort of, I don't know, refinement of that rollout over time? Or do you think that that sort of siloed structure where it might be broken down by region is being a problem to wide-scale transformation?
It could be either. I'm not sitting on the fence. It could be either. I mean, if you look at tech companies and how they've scaled themselves in the last decade or so, hate to pull out the Spotify model, but it's the most famous. So breaking things down to their component parts of delivery and isolating things that can be delivered in parallel, that's a way to test something amongst several teams at the same time. And if somebody adopts a particular thing that works for them, everybody else learns from it. There would be nothing to stop a particularly regional trust in the NHS trying something as part of knowledge that none of the others are doing it. If it works for them, then they share to everybody else. And if you have 50 trusts, they can all be trying 50 things, and then gradually build up to quite a big system. But I would suspect the way things are at the minute, they're all working in such isolation that that's not likely to happen, and there'll be a lot of overlap. So I think somewhere between central knowledge of a roadmap and central understanding of what's doable, and breaking that work down to sensible chunks amongst the regions, that could go a long way. But there's also a layer above that. We just talked about the notion of a marketplace. I mean, that doesn't have to belong to anywhere. Mm-hmm. You know, if there's a national marketplace that isn't actually offering NHS services, it's just offering NHS approved services, that's slightly different. So you could do either at the same time quite easily, I would think. Easily is not a word you attach to the NHS, though.
No, I bet. And I suppose that the difficulty as well is that, you know, in a lot of organizations, when you talk about digital transformation, you're talking about automation via process refinement. You're potentially talking about new and novel data capture, data storage, data usage. And you think there's probably, you know, probably a range of security issues that are related to each of those disciplines within the health service and within healthcare kind of writ large, which the NHS will face into over the next little while. I mean, the difficulty in the private sector is significant in those spaces, let alone in the public sector.
There is one fascinating way to think about it, though, if you sort of bridge between tech and the NHS. So tech in the last 7-8 years, I guess, or thereabouts, has got hooked on the notion of setting hypotheses. And it did exist long before in certain quarters, but it's now routine for developers to think about a hypothesis and how to test it successfully within tolerance and so on. You would think, rather than the sort of grand scale transformations that the NHS has tried before, given their scientists ultimately at heart that run the thing by and large, you would imagine that they could adopt that sort of protocol that, if anybody's going to come up with a hypothesis and test it, it would be scientists. So I would imagine that if they adopted a mindset that's more familiar to them, that's probably not the sort of big tech they assume it might be, then they might get somewhere a bit quicker.
Interesting. Well, moving on from health, our other sort of primary vertical that we work in is financial services. And so we were interested to read, I think 2 weeks ago now, that the UK credit builder startup Lockbox had announced a partnership with ClearScore. And I suppose that their proposition is based on proving that you can save on a monthly basis to show your credit worthiness, which is, I suppose, a new data stream which potentially wouldn't have fitted within the kind of credit scoring system previously. Do you think that we're starting to see a new trend, or the development of a trend where digital is supporting financial inclusion? And do you think that that kind of ideal is something that a lot of organizations are actually trying to get to at this point?
Yes, I've got two answers to this. I hope we've got time for it. It came up in a separate discussion, but it's the same theme. So things like Lockbox, as I understand it, have been on the market for years in other ways. So you may have been sent a credit card in the post, which offers 900% interest rate, but your credit limit's 20 quid to start with. But it lets you build up a credit score without that much risk. It's almost like a payday loan. It's a form of credit, and if you pay it back, there's nothing really wrong with that. You build up a profile. But
of course.
So I'm not going to name the brands, there are many of them, but you did get offered a card based on a poor credit score that let you rebuild it. And Lockbox isn't quite the same, but it's giving you a way to do the same thing, that you're building up credit credibility by paying it off. The difference between the two things is, you imagine applying tech to that rather than sending things in the post, which is expensive, and having the sort of old school backup of running a credit card center of some kind wasn't cheap, hence the rates they had to offer. So something like Lockbox, I would assume, democratizes it by running it in a much more straightforward technical way, and it brings the barrier down for actually setting up that kind of company. And the other thing that came to mind from a discussion within Oracle the other week was wealth management and the sort of apps that have sprung up in the last year that almost make share trading like going to the bookies. So if you use one of these apps, there's several. If you use Twitter, you advertise them every 5 minutes, pretty much, that can let you trade fractional shares. So you can buy into Amazon for a fiver and ride it out, or Tesla, which people have done. It's the same thing. A friend of mine who's been a stockbroker for about 20 years said, how do they do that? Because he still pays Hargreaves Lansdown, to name one, that sort of company, 10, 12 pounds a trade. How do they do it for free? I said, well, they're doing it incredibly cheaply to grab the market. They're probably funded up to a point and making a loss on it until there's a scale that the tech pays for itself.
Yep.
But he couldn't understand that coming from the old world. And it feels similar, that there's a crossover between something that used to exist and something that can be done much more efficiently through tech and acquire users through tech and all the things that we understand makes it possible. So yeah, that was my thinking on it, but there's many applications of that process if you think about it.
Yeah, because I mean, my thinking when I was thinking about what financial inclusion means, there's like a level of which is, there used to be a sort of fully cash-based economy where, there's kind of a group of people who were considered unbanked. And like in the UK, that's probably a much smaller percentage than it is globally. And then if you're unbanked, then you don't have access to credit. And, in some instances, even when you are banked, you are like not safeguarded against poverty premiums. So like if you've got your energy on a card rather than having it on a direct debit. But then also there's the argument about connectivity and device accessibility. There's a lot of services that are only available really through smartphones, and being able to have enough money to cover, having a data plan and whatnot. And so you think about like the whole range of what financial inclusion means, and then you come down to a level at which it's about finding sort of new novel data points and feeding them into a legacy system. Because I've worked in financial services organizations where there's a very hard cutoff on credit scoring for things like loans or credit cards, and that might mean that you get, out of every 100 credit card applications, you only ever get 20 of those 100 actually getting a credit card. It's an incredibly inefficient system. Whereas actually, if you find new data points, you might be able to give 35 out of those 100 people a credit card. You find a whole range of other data, and you might be able to give 50 out of 100. I mean, it's significantly different to when my father worked in banking, and he looked into someone's eyes and thought, you know, do I think they have good values and strong morals, and will they pay me back? You know, we have to rely on data nowadays. But you wonder if the ideal is like a moving target that will just consistently be adding new data streams into the credit scoring process and into the sort of financial inclusivity cycle to be able to try and have just a more, I suppose, holistic understanding of whether someone should be offered a financial service product or not.
I think so. I think it's still evolving. I remember working on a project about 10, 11 years ago where advertising online was going to be selected for you individually based on your Mosaic profile, which one of Experian's old amongst others. Yeah. So if you were C1, C2, whatever, that kind of thing, you'd be offered a particular brand of beer versus another from the same company. So within these big beer groups, you know, they would split you between Skol and Stella, that sort of ends of the scale, you know, not being unkind to either, and things like that. And the basic starting point was male and female, actually. So you might be offered one razor or another in a shower or something like that. So it's all possible. And looking into that at the time, it was quite scary, the sort of things you could tell just from somebody's email address, from all the data points that these companies gather. So you would imagine that's all there to be used. It's all about the execution of which data you apply to which score and things like that. And I suppose companies like ClearScore, again, are applying technology to do that in a much bigger and cheaper way, and have got somewhere with it. But I always think banks and phone companies missed a trick years ago, because the one thing people don't give up now is having a phone. And the fact it's almost your last line of payment. So people have got paper day meters and things like that in their house for electricity and so on, and having to buy cards and things. There's whole layers of things that don't really need to exist with a bit of technology, from the consumption to the phone, because those are the two things that most people won't live without: heat and their phone these days. So I always thought there was a trick missed for democratizing money that banks and phones probably missed about 20 years ago, but maybe one for another day.
Yeah, definitely. It's a fascinating topic. If we're sticking to a reasonably tight timeline, which we have said that we will try to do, David, we'll move on to the next one, to a topic which is very dear to your heart, I know, in terms of voice applications. So last week or 2 weeks ago, I believe it might have been, that there was an announcement that Amazon would allow you to switch your Echo and other devices from Alexa to a new masculine voice called Ziggy. Yeah, I mean, I had a joke planned about how this is software developers who struggle to speak to women in real life, creating a digital male voice so that they don't have to do it even when they interface with their devices. But yeah, I suppose I've put that out there now. But I mean, I suppose that the point that I wanted to make was, do you think that our interaction with these devices over time will mean that we'll want to adopt voices which have like localized accents and use common parlance, or do you think that there's always going to be the kind of the one or two voices, and that splitting them by gender is kind of you know, it's just that, you know, probably the sort of tip of the iceberg, so to speak?
So the answer is it depends, and there's an entire episode of this in the making. But if you take it back to first principles of Ziggy, we'll stick to that since that's your question. If you imagine, and I wrote a rant about this about 3 years ago, once I'd left Amazon, I might point out, that if you're speaking to an assistant, you don't know who's delivering the answer.
Okay.
Because it could be Amazon itself. I need to be careful what I say, because there's one sitting behind me that I forgot to turn off. It could be the platform answering, or it could be a third-party service. And there's a blurred line between who answers anything. And it came up as soon as Ziggy became a thing. Developers don't get to know which gender of voice they've been asked for. So if somebody says, I'll just say Alexa, and there might be noise in the background, or Ziggy, one's male, one's female. Now, there are some products that have been built down the years only ever expecting the female Alexa voice. Some of them actually prompt you to do this thing again, just say, Alexa, do thing. BBC went through all sorts of hoops to make that work for children, so they knew how to ask for another podcast or something like that in the BBC Kids school. So if you don't know what's been presenting the question to you, and you answer as a male or a female, then your answer is technically wrong. And it does expose a kind of complexity under the bonnet for these things that people don't realize. But once you develop for them, you have to start thinking about that. So it has been a genuine problem for developers this last week that suddenly their services sound wrong. And they're presenting he when you've asked for she, or vice versa, and things like that. So there is a whole world of pain in that if people don't quite appreciate it. But it's a good thing. I mean, one of the things we used to get asked working at Amazon at the time, all the time, was why is it only female? And they finally at least answered that question and presented an option. When we were trying to make Beeb at the BBC, we went down a particular road based on the research we had, and that voice was male, soft regional male, to use your point. But it was a sort of an everyman voice, synthesized Manchester, but pretty bland the way it was synthesized, that it was accessible to everyone. And there were plans to regionalize other voices, present genders for different things, just like you would have a male and female newsreader, for example. It would be natural for an assistant to move between them depending on the context. So yeah, thorny one, but I could spend days talking about this if you felt like it.
Yeah, I suppose that like there's probably a deal to be done with some like uber famous celebrity, like the one with the most Twitter followers, and say like you can be the third voice. It'll be like Jay-Z or Katy Perry or Justin Bieber or like.
Well, funny you say that. The first one that was synthesized as a celebrity was Samuel L. Jackson.
There
and
you go.
you could pay for his voice to be part of the default. Now, it was never the fact that you asked for the weather and get him saying it, because it was quite sweary. But you could opt into certain things being Samuel L. Jackson for 99 cents or whatever it was. And I think Google went for John Legend.
Wow, there you go.
Because they all copy each other, right? So they do exist to a point, but they're not the assistant. It's a value add. Now, if you want to keep another topic for later, because we'll never have time to think about it, one of the things that came up as a possible piece of work at the BBC was, should we synthesize David Attenborough?
Wow. And
therefore, what happens to the voice and who owns the synthesized version at some point in the future? And you can guess what I'm thinking about. So there's a whole ethical topic on these things that would take all day to talk about as well. But yeah, there's much. What started off as a fairly benign thought about Ziggy, it would open up many episodes.
Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose in it, I think it's, what is it, season 1 or season 2 of Black Mirror, where they have that episode of the boyfriend who passes away, and they take all his Twitter data to sort of generate at first, a text version of how he would speak, and then laterally they start to incorporate it into some kind of like Android version of him. But I suppose that with so much data out there and so much recorded sound and video and the like, it does get into a pretty murky world to understand who owns the delivery of some of these lines and the focus of some of these shows that have been developed over the years. And someone like David Attenborough is like, it's one that I always think to myself, like, it's like everyone's granddad. Like it's literally like he's the everyman's granddad. So it would be like, if you were ever going to push the boundaries on ethics, you would want to push the boundaries on ethics with David Attenborough's voice. That's
I was going to say, I mean, a lot of these voices that live in assistants, they all started with a person in the first place, or multiple people. Other than one of the voices of Siri, who found out later that that's what she was. She didn't know that at the time it was recorded, and has now made herself a bit of a celebrity over it. Voiceover artist, most of the people have contracts in place that they're never exposed as one of the voices, and never will be, because they think it may ruin their life if it turns out further down people can synthesize them and make their voice speak things. And quite often the voices are multiple. I think Alexa might have had 14 or thereabouts synthesized into one. Wow. So it's deniable for one thing, and secondly, it's not really anybody's voice. So there is again a world of grief in that if you did it wrong. But it's equally these days not hard to do. If you had enough recordings of somebody, to do it well takes about 2,000 hours, if I remember right, of somebody's voice. But you can do it in a lot less than that.
Yeah, talking about sort of many years later becoming a celebrity, I've seen on Instagram a few times recently people getting videos with the guy who did EA Sports, Cindy Game, which is a very sort of niche reference for people of our generation who played, kind of. Whether it was FIFA on the Mega Drive or whatever it was that was a good hook, a good vocal hook from those days of computing.
If anybody's interested, to Google the word Sonic branding, and then you could be there all day looking into all these things from the past. You'll know the Intel jingle without even knowing who Intel are, I'm sure. But
oh, amazing. Well, thanks so much for your time. I know that it's very precious, and we'll obviously be doing this a lot more regularly, and hopefully with either a third or a fourth party involved. So that is us for the first ever Waracle podcast. And if you want to find us, you'll find us at all of the relevant social channels at Waracle UK and on our website, waracle.com. So thanks again, David. And
pleasure.
that's us done for today. Cheers.
See you again soon.
Bye now.